this may get interrupted. So if it does, I'll do a part 2. This is a little bit of a longer chapter. So 2.3 is called a disappointment. So all of the chapters have some sort of significance. So be thinking about what the title of this chapter could maybe mean. And it's picking up exactly where the last chapter left off. And remember, I think I said probably in class that what's confusing about this chapter is that, the lawyers and the witnesses and different people are talking, but it doesn't use quotation marks a lot of the time, so you just have to kind of follow along. So, Mr. Attorney General, who was against Charles Darnay, had to inform the jury that the prisoner before them, though young in years, was old in treasonable practices which claimed the forfeit of his life, that his correspondence with the public enemy was not a correspondence of today or of yesterday or of even last year or of the year before, that it was the certain prisoner who had, for longer than that, been in the habit of passing and repassing between France and England on secret business on which he could give no honest account, that if it were in the nature of traitorous ways to thrive, which happily it never was, the real wickedness and guilt of his business might have remained undiscovered. So remember, we learned in the previous chapter that Darnay is accused of giving secrets to the French, who then helped the Americans with the Revolutionary War in America. And so he's also accused, we're finding out, of he would travel back and forth between England and France on secret business, and he won't say what it was. That Providence, however, had put it into the heart of a person who was beyond fear and beyond reproach to ferry out the nature of the prisoner's schemes, and struck with horror to disclose them to His Majesty's Chief Secretary of State and most honorable Privy Council, that this patriot would be produced before them. So a patriot is someone who just loves their country. So someone supposedly has some evidence that proves that Darnay is a traitor. And the only reason they're stepping forward is they just love their country and they think that what Darnay is doing isn't right. And because they love their country so much, they're speaking up. That his position and attitude were, on the whole, sublime. That he had been the prisoner's friend, but at once, in an auspicious and evil hour detecting his infamy, had resolved to immolate the traitor he could no longer cherish in his bosom on the sacred altar of his country, that if statues were decreed in Britain, as in ancient Greece and Rome, to public benefactors, this shining citizen would assuredly have been one. So this guy who's stepping forward is the best of the best. He's a shining citizen, never ever done anything wrong, certainly. This is all the Attorney General speaking. That if they were not so decreed, he probably would not have one. That virtue, as had been observed by the poets in many passages, which he well knew the jury would have word for word at the tips of their tongues, whereat the jury's countenances displayed a guilty consciousness that they knew nothing more about the passages, was in a manner contagious, more especially the bright virtue known as patriotism or love of country. That the lofty example of this immaculate and unimpeachable witness for the crown, to refer to whom, however, unworthily was an honor, had communicated itself to the prisoner's servant, and had engendered him in a holy determination to examine his master's table drawers and pockets and secret his papers. That he, Mr. Attorney General, was prepared to hear some disparagement attempted of his admirable servant, but that, in a general way, he preferred him to, as Mr. Attorney General's brothers and sisters, and honored him more than his, Mr. Attorney General's father and mother. So again, like best of the best kind of guy. That he called with confidence on the jury to come and do likewise, that the evidence of these two witnesses, coupled with the documents of their discovering that would be produced, would show the prisoner to have been furnished with lists of His Majesty's forces and of their disposition and preparation both by land and sea. So Charles Darnay, according to this patriot, whomever he is, has lists about military and naval secrets that would have been used during the Revolutionary War. So huge deal. And supposedly this guy can prove it. and would leave no doubt that he had habitually conveyed such information to a hostile power, America. And these lists could not be provided to be in the prisoner's handwriting, but that it was all the same. So it's not in his handwriting, but it's all the same, that indeed it was rather the better for the prosecution, as showing the prisoner to be artful in his precautions. That the proof would go back 5 years and would show the prisoner already engaged in these pernicious missions within a few weeks before the date of the very first action fought between the British troops and the Americans. So the timing of it is like just right. And that for these reasons, the jury, being a loyal jury, as he knew they were, and being a responsible jury, as he knew they were, must positively find the prisoner guilty and make an end of him, whether they liked it or not. They could never lay their heads down upon their pillows. They could never tolerate the idea of their wives laying their heads upon their pillows. They could never endure the notion of their children laying their heads upon their pillows. In short, that there never could be, for them or theirs, any laying of heads upon pillows at all, unless the prisoner's head was taken off. That head, Mr. Attorney General concluded by demanding of them, in the name of everything he could think of, with a round turn in it, and on the faith of his solemn asseveration that he already considered the prisoner as good as dead and gone. When the Attorney General ceased, a buzz arose in the court, as if a great cloud of great blue flies were swarming about the prisoner, in anticipation of what he was soon to become. When toned down again, the unimpeachable patriot appeared in the witness box. So think about what flies congregate around, like rotting and dead things. So we heard before, Darnay is pretty much as good as dead, and the real trial is about to start, and so we're about to hear from this witness, or these witnesses that supposedly have information against him. With the blue fly thing, think about weather and nature and kind of lump it into that category. So Mr. Solicitor General, who in class we're going to talk about, is C.J. Stryver, following his leader's lead, examined the patriot John Barsad, gentleman by name. So witness number 1 is John Barsad. This is the kind of thing where it seems like not an important name at all. It's just going to be like a character who comes in really briefly and goes away. There's no such thing in this book. So you need to kind of remember all of the names of these characters. So this guy, John Barsad, witness 1. The story of his pure soul was exactly what Mr. Attorney General had described it to be. Perhaps, if it had a fault, a little too exactly, having released his noble bosom of his burden, he would have modestly withdrawn himself, but that the wigged gentleman with the papers before him, sitting not far from Mr. Lorry, begged to ask him a few questions. So Stryver is going to stand up and cross-examine him, basically. He's going to start asking a few questions of this witness, who supposedly is just a patriot and just loves his country. The wigged gentleman sitting opposite, still looking at the ceiling of the court. So we talked about this other guy who's looking at the ceiling. That's Sidney Carton. We also talked about the fact that, if somebody's just staring at the ceiling, it implies that they're not into it. They don't care about what's going on. So that's what it seems like. So now here's where it's a little bit confusing. So these are the questions that Stryver is asking Barsad and Barsad's answers, but they're not separated by quotation marks. So just know that any question is coming from Stryver and any answer is coming from the witness, Barsad. So Stryver says, had he ever been a spy himself? No, he scorned the base insinuation. What did he live upon? His property. Where was his property? He didn't precisely remember where it was. What was it? No business of anybody's. Had he inherited it? Yes, he had. From whom? Distant relation. Very distant? Rather. Ever been in prison? Certainly not. Never in a debtor's prison? Didn't see what that had to do with it. Never in a debtor's prison? Come, once again, never? Yes. How many times? 2 or 3 times. Not 5 or 6? Perhaps. Of what profession? Gentlemen. Ever been kicked? Might have been. Frequently? No. Ever kicked downstairs? Decidedly not. Once received a kick on the top of a staircase and fell downstairs of his own accord. Kicked on that occasion for cheating at dice? Something to that effect was said by the intoxicated liar who committed the assault, but it was not true. Swear it was not true? Positively. Ever lived by cheating at play? Never. Ever lived by play? That's gambling. Not more than other gentlemen do. Ever borrow money of the prisoner? Yes. Ever pay him? No. Was not this intimacy with the prisoner in reality a very slight one, forced upon the prisoner in coaches, inns, and packets? No. Sure, he saw the prisoner with these lists? Certain. Knew no more about the lists? No. Had not procured them himself, for instance? No. Expect to get anything by this evidence? No. Not in regular government pay and employment to lay traps? Oh dear no. Or to do anything? Oh dear no. Swear to that? Over and over again, no motives but motives of sheer patriotism. None whatever. So basically what's just happened with this patriot witness is that he looks really bad. We find out that first of all, he's lying half this time. But when Stryver is questioning him, we find out that he's been to prison a bunch of times, debtor's prison. He owes Darnay money. He definitely didn't make the lists himself, which makes it sound like he maybe did make the lists. And his only motive is just being a patriot. So again, all of a sudden, this guy who was this stand-up witness when the Attorney General was speaking suddenly seems not as credible. The virtuous servant, Roger Cly, witness number 2, swore his way through the case at a great rate. He had taken service with the prisoner in good faith and simplicity 4 years ago. He had asked the prisoner aboard the Calais packet if he wanted a handy fellow, and the prisoner had engaged him. He had not asked the prisoner to take the handy fellow as an act of charity, never thought of such a thing. He began to have suspicions of the prisoner and to keep an eye upon him soon afterward. In arranging his clothes while traveling, he had seen similar lists to these in the prisoner's pockets over and over again. So witness number 2, Roger Cly, says he's seen these lists with Darnay a lot. He had not put them there first. Also sounds really sketchy. He had seen the prisoner show these identical lists to French gentlemen at Calais and similar lists to French gentlemen at Calais and Bologna. He loved his country and couldn't bear it and had given information. He had never been suspected of stealing a silver teapot. He had been maligned respecting a mustard pot, but it turned out to be only a plated one. He had known the last witness 7 or 8 years, and that was merely a coincidence. So it just so happens that Roger Cly and John Barsad know each other, but that has nothing to do with the fact that they are both here as witnesses against Charles Darnay. Again, really sketchy. Neither did he call it a curious coincidence that true patriotism was his only motive too. He was a true Briton and hoped that there were many like him. The blue flies buzzed again, so that's the audience, and Mr. Attorney General called Mr. Jarvis Lorry. Mr. Jarvis Lorry, you are a clerk in Tellson's Bank? I am. On a certain Friday night in November, 1775, did business occasion you to travel between London and Dover by the mail? It did. Were there any other passengers in the mail? 2. Did they alight on the road in the course of the night? They did. Mr. Lorry, look upon the prisoner. Was he one of those 2 passengers? The night that they're talking about is the night that Mr. Lorry has the dream. And remember, we talked about the fact that Lorry didn't know who else was sitting next to him. Why? What was the reason that Mr. Lorry didn't know who else was on that coach with him? Think about that. Think about whether he can answer this question. Could one of those people have been Charles Darnay? Then he responds with, both were so wrapped up, and the night was so dark, and we were all so reserved that I cannot undertake to say even that. Mr. Lorry, look again upon the prisoner. Supposing him wrapped up as those 2 passengers were, is there anything in his bulk and stature to render it unlikely that he was one of them? No. You will not swear, Mr. Lorry, that he was not one of them? No. So he legitimately doesn't know. So at least you say he may have been one of them? Yes, except that I remember them both to have been like myself, timorous of highwaymen, and the prisoner has not a timorous air. Did you ever see a counterfeit of timidity, Mr. Lorry? I certainly have seen that. Mr. Lorry, look once more upon the prisoner. Have you seen him to your certain knowledge before? I have. When? I was returning from France a few days afterward at Calais. The prisoner came on board the packet ship in which I returned and made the voyage with me. So this is after they've picked up Dr. Manette. Darnay was on the boat back from France to England. At what hour did he come on board? A little after midnight. In the dead of the night, was he the only passenger who came on board at that untimely hour? He happened to be the only one. Never mind about happening, Mr. Lorry. He was the only passenger who came on board in the dead of the night. He was. Were you traveling alone, Mr. Lorry, or with any companion? With 2 companions, a gentleman and a lady. They are here. They are here. Had you any conversation with the prisoner? Hardly any. The weather was stormy and the passage long and rough, and I lay on a sofa almost from shore to shore. Miss Manette. So now Lucy gets called. The young lady to whom all eyes had been turned before, and were now turned again, stood up where she had sat. Her father rose with her, and kept her hand drawn through his arm. Miss Manette, look upon the prisoner. To be confronted with such pity and such earnest youth and beauty was far more trying to the accused than to be confronted with all the crowd. Standing, as it were, apart with her on the edge of his grave, not all the staring and curiosity that looked on could, for the moment, nerve him to remain quite still. His hurried right hand parceled out the herbs before him into imaginary beds of flowers in a garden, and his efforts to control and steady his breathing shook the lips from which the color rushed to his heart. The buzz of the great flies was loud again. Miss Manette, have you seen the prisoner before? Yes, sir. Where? On board of the packet ship just now referred to, sir, and on the same occasion. You are the young lady just now referred to? Oh, most unhappily I am. So again, we said this before, she doesn't want to be a witness against Darnay. The plaintive tone of her compassion merged into the less musical voice of the judge as he said something fiercely. Answer the questions put to you and make no remark upon them. Miss Manette, had you any conversation with the prisoner on that passage across the channel? Yes, sir. Recall it. In the midst of a profound stillness, she faintly began. When the gentleman came on board, do you mean the prisoner? Inquired the judge, knitting his brows. Yes, my lord. Then say the prisoner. When the prisoner came on board, he noticed that my father, turning her eyes lovingly to him as he stood beside her, was much fatigued and in a very weak state of health. My father was so reduced, and I was afraid to take him out of the air, and I made a bed for him on the deck, near the cabin steps, and I sat on the deck at his side to take care of him. There were no other passengers that night but we 4. The prisoner was so good as to beg permission to advise me how I could shelter my father from the wind and weather better than I had done. I had not known how to do it well, not understanding how the wind would set when we were out of the harbor. He did it for me. He expressed great gentleness and kindness for my father's state, and I am sure he felt it. That was the manner of our beginning to speak together. So they meet by Darnay helping during that night on their way back. Let me interrupt you for a moment. He had come on board alone? No. How many were with him? 2 French gentlemen. Had they conferred together? They had conferred together until the last moment when it was necessary for the French gentlemen to be landed in their boat. Had any papers been handed out among them similar to these lists? Some papers had been handed about among them, but I don't know what papers. Like these in shape and size? Possibly, but indeed I don't know, although they stood whispering very near to me, because they stood at the top of the cabin steps to have the light of the lamp that was hanging there. It was a dull lamp, and they spoke very low, and I did not hear what they said, and only saw that they looked at papers. So this part probably doesn't look so great for Darnay. Now to the prisoner's conversation, Miss Manette. The prisoner was as open in his confidence with me, which arose out of my helpless situation, as he was kind and good and useful to my father. I hope, bursting into tears, I may not repay him by doing him harm today. Buzzing from the blue flies. Miss Manette, if the prisoner does not perfectly understand that you give the evidence which it is your duty to give, which you must give, and which you cannot escape from giving with great unwillingness, he is the only person present in that condition. Please to go on. He told me that he was traveling on business of a delicate and difficult nature which might get people into trouble, and he was therefore traveling under an assumed name. So Charles Darnay is not his real name. He said that his business had, within a few days, taken him back to France and might at intervals take him backward and forward between France and England for a long time to come. That doesn't look very good. Did he say anything about America, Miss Manette? Be particular. He tried to explain to me how that quarrel had arisen, and he said that, so far as he could judge, it was a wrong and foolish one on England's part. So this is a treason trial. He's being accused of being a traitor. And Lucy's standing up. She doesn't want to hurt him, but she just says that the problems between England and America started because of England. Not good. And then he added in a jesting way that perhaps George Washington might gain almost as great a name in history as George III, their current king. But there was no harm in his way of saying it. He said it laughingly and to beguile the time. Again, he makes this joke that George Washington, America's leader, is far better than Britain's leader, and this is a treason case, so he looks really, really bad. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to run out of time, so I will pick up in a minute with the second half of this chapter. So this chapter is stopping 3/4 of the way down on page 70.